I spend my life in a state of confusion, and so this is no problem. I'm going to ask you tonight, if you have a Bible, to go in the Old Testament to the little book of Habakkuk. Little book of Habakkuk. I doubt anybody read from Habakkuk today in your daily Bible reading, but I need you to go there tonight, if you will. And if you have trouble finding it, in my Bible, it's page 823, if that helps you at all. It's so good to be with you again. I've enjoyed this annual trek to Ocala for years and years now. You all are always so hospitable and kind. You make me feel so welcome among you, and I am very grateful for that. Thankful for the things that we've shared over the years. Wayne and I were talking at dinner tonight. Back, we used to do the Bring the Book lectures together, and those were always very special. And before that, the first few times I came to this congregation was when you were still in your old old building. And so that's been a long time now. And you all have just, in so many ways, been a wonderful church and been a beacon of good things in Florida. And to be a part of that on an annual basis has been very, very special. So good to be with you again tonight. So I shortened the title simply to The Cry of Why, because I didn't have room on my cover slide for the title that Jody gave me. But I do want to talk tonight about the cry of why. The cry of why, and that's what we're talking about tonight. If God is loving, if God is powerful, then why in fact do bad things happen to good people? I ask you to open to the book of Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk's name may not be on the tip of your tongue, but I will guarantee you that his concerns are tucked away in the recesses of your heart. His book, if you have found it, I want us to read just 2 or 3 verses to begin in Habakkuk 1, and beginning in verse 1, where he says, "The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry to you, there is violence, and yet you do not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? Plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention that arises. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, and therefore perverse judgment proceeds." With that introduction, you can understand that Habakkuk, in fact, in many ways, is a book for those who know and have spoken the cry of why. I will tell you that there is no question that has disturbed me any more in my adult life. When I was a boy, when I was a young man, I grew up fairly sheltered from the cry of why. Perhaps you did as well. I grew up in a very average middle-class home. We were protected from much of the evil and the hurt that was in the world. I didn't see it portrayed on the news. I really didn't know the evil that happened in the world on a regular basis. But I will tell you that as a gospel preacher, I have been faced with the cry of why on far, far too many occasions. I have stood before tiny little coffins holding the tiny little body of a child that has died. I stood before the coffin a while back of an 18-year-old boy in the state of Indiana that I had known since his birth, and he was preparing to come to Florida College, that was killed in an accident. I stood before the coffin of a mother of 3 boys, and she had lost her battle with cancer. I stood in the coffin of a 44-year-old father, a father of 2, back in December. We try to find words to comfort individuals in those kinds of circumstances, but the cry of why persists in our heart, doesn't it? And it's not just those kind of tragic issues, it's relational issues as well. One of the pictures that I've had and had for decades now is one that I absolutely cherish. It's from when Vicki and I were newly married. I preached in New Albany, Indiana for a number of years, and there were 6 couples there. We were one of 6 couples. We all were married about the same time. We all had our first babies about the same time, and we did everything together. We loved each other dearly, and we did everything together. It breaks my heart that 3 of those couples have divorced now. And I look at that and I wonder why. The cry of why is for the lady who spent 20 years of her life trying to be a good and faithful, loyal maid, and now she has been deserted by her husband. The cry of why is for the gentleman in Illinois I know whose wife has early onset Alzheimer's, and she now, young in life, does not recognize either his face or his voice. The cry of why is for the children in this country of affluence, who go to bed at night hungry. It's for those who have sent loved ones off to war, only to have them never return. The cry of why is for those who have experienced a career that is sour, dreams that have been shattered, children that have rebelled, and friends who have betrayed. The greatest challenge of faith, ladies and gentlemen, is not science. It is history. It is asking the question, how can we look back through the telescope of time and see a world that has been scarred and torn by all of these things? How do we watch the nightly news night after night and then come together in an assembly like this and sing, He's got the whole world in His hands? Our coping mechanism, I think, is that we just try to find a little more entertainment, a little more diversion. We change the channel. But the reality of living in a fallen world doesn't go away. It is no wonder that several years ago, Rabbi Kushner had a best-selling book with the simple title, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? That really was the question of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk addresses the issue of theodicy. It's a theological word that just asks that question, that if God is good and God is powerful and God is loving, then why doesn't he do something about these things? Why isn't He doing something about the injustice that seems to hold sway in the world? I will tell you that Habakkuk was not the first, nor was he the last to ask that. The psalmist asked that. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel of my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Tell me that you have not sung that song. And for 4 times he would say it. How long, how long, how long, how long? That, by the way, was the cry of Joseph in prison, and Jeremiah in the pit, and Jesus Christ on the cross. It is the cry of every Christian who has ever looked at a situation and said, you know what, that just doesn't seem right. I will guarantee you that there are people in this room tonight who this week have asked the why questions. Why is this happening? Why won't it get over? Why doesn't God do something? Why now, God? Why, God, if you are good and loving and powerful, would you allow this to happen in my life? Why do I hurt? Why don't they understand? Why isn't this working out? Why is this happening to me? Why aren't you hearing my prayer? Those were the questions of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is the only, you're good Bible students, and so you know this, that Habakkuk is the only minor prophet that doesn't address the people. Now, the people certainly in his day needed to be addressed. Judah is in a mess. Most of the writers who were contemporary with him, they blamed the people for their sins and the rulers for their godless leadership, and they were right, of course, in doing that. But Habakkuk speaks to God. He doesn't take God's complaint to the people. He takes his complaint to God. Martin Luther suggests that Habakkuk means embracer. And it was appropriate, he said, because Habakkuk takes the problems into his own heart and he embraces them until he receives an answer from God. Habakkuk, we can think about in a couple of ways. His ministry simply is that he was a prophet. And so the book begins, the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. And so he is a prophet of God. God's nation is in moral and ethical and spiritual decline. They did evil in the sight of the Lord seems to be the continual summary phrase. Habakkuk is called to write. He's called to write spiritual words to a dying nation that had very little use for spirituality. But primarily he will write and he will say to God, especially in the first chapter, God, why did you let this happen? And God, why don't you do something about this? His burden, as it's spoken of in verse 1, the burden of the prophet Habakkuk. The burden was twofold. The first was the sins of his people, and they were many. But secondly, the silence of his God. And that's what he will begin to immediately address. And so that's what he said. Oh Lord, how long, echoing the words of the psalmist, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Cry to you that there is violence, and yet you will not save. It is always the hardest part of the cry of why, is it not? If God would just answer that question for us, if God would just explain Just explain. Tell us what you're up to. Tell us what you're thinking. Tell us why you're allowing these things to happen. Tell us, God, what is in the back of your mind. Now, I'll tell you at the very beginning that I think in large measure he does. Now, don't misunderstand me. Not in point-by-point specifics for every difficulty that arises, but in perspective, in trying to help us see the larger pictures that are at play, again, in the reality of living in a fallen world. Now listen to me very carefully about that. When you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, it's interesting that in Scripture, it is not unbelief, but it is deep, abiding faith that causes someone to ask with the psalmist, why and how long? That is a question of people of faith. You don't ask those questions unless you believe that God is loving and powerful. You don't ask those questions unless you have something to lose and you believe that God could easily intervene and make the situation better. If you're an atheist, of course, you don't believe that there is a God, and so you believe that life is merely a series of random chance, and so you don't ask the question of why at all. If you were, for example, in ancient days a polytheist, you didn't ask that question. You believed that there were multiple gods, and so the gods that made things go well, maybe they were more powerful this year, and the gods who made things go bad, some years they would be more powerful. And so you didn't ask why. It was just a matter of which God happened to be taking precedent that year. If you were a deist, you believe in God, but you believe that God is apathetic. That God gave the girl a good spin, and then he sat down in heaven, and he's just waiting for it to run out. But you believe that God's apathetic, he doesn't care. And so you can ask that until you're blue in the face, but he's not going to care, and he's certainly not going to answer that question for you. But we do believe. We believe deeply. And we do believe that he is loving and that he is powerful and that he is a God of justice and that he is a God of faithfulness. And so we want to know. We need to know. How do we reconcile our belief in those attributes of God and what we see played out in our nation, in our churches, and in our individual lives? Now, God will answer Habakkuk. How long? Why? And God immediately says to Habakkuk, his prophet, he said, look, I do see, I do know, I do care, and I will act. In fact, look at verses 5 and 6 of chapter 1. God answers, and he says, look among the nations and watch and be utterly astounded. I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though I were to tell you. For indeed I am raising up the Babylonians, a bitter and impetuous nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not there. In fact, God says, look, I was working out a solution to this issue before you even bore. So don't think that I'm unaware of what is going on. Well, Habakkuk responds to God and he says, wait, God, that's overkill. I mean, that's like trying to kill a mosquito with a shotgun. I want you to act, but that's too much. And God says, no, that's what I'm going to do. And so with his senses assaulted, Habakkuk retreats to what he knows to be true about God. And so look at chapter 1 and verse number 12. Habakkuk has to get his footing, and so he finds his footing by saying this, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord, for you have appointed them for judgment. O rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of pure eyes than to behold evil. You cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? And so what Habakkuk does is he retreats to what he knows about God. And he says, God, here's what I know about you. I'm trying to make sense of the world. I don't understand the way you say you're going to respond. So let me retreat to what I know is true about you. I know, God, that you are everlasting. That's what he says. Are you not everlasting? And the point of that is, ladies and gentlemen, that God makes history. God makes it. He is not controlled by history. God makes history. It's hard for us to think of it that way. It's hard for us because we're human to think outside the human box. It's hard for us to realize sometimes what Paul said. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Consider is a word that implies logic. And Paul says the logic is that whatever we may endure in this life is not worthy to be compared with what's going to be brought to us by an eternal God. And he's saying life is so short when compared with eternity. That's what we sing when we've been there 10,000 years, bright, shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. It's why Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 4, and beginning in verse number 16, therefore, we do not lose heart. For though the outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Listen to that. How could this man who wrote what he did to the Corinthians about what he had endured and suffered, how could he write and say this is light affliction? Because for him there was perspective that there's something everlasting about us because we serve an everlasting God. And so he said, we do not look at things that are seen, but things that are not seen. Things that are seen are temporary, but things that are not seen are eternal. And Habakkuk said, secondly, God is holy. God is holy. And we say, well, what? And that's what he asks. Are you not holy? What does that have to do with suffering? What does God's holiness have to do with human suffering? I think just this. If God is holy, then he cannot command anything that would be wrong. And so whatever discipline that God may allow in this world and whatever he may allow to come into our lives must be vested in his wisdom and in his righteousness. If God is a holy God, then nothing in his superintending providential care of his children can be outside of his will. If we understand that and believe that, then we can understand what Paul meant when he said in Romans chapter 8, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, those who've been called according to his purpose. You've heard this 1,000 times, I know, but let's hear it for the 1,001st time. That does not say that all things are good, because all things are not good. There is much in this world, and often much that comes into our lives, that simply is not good. But the promise is that because God is a holy God who superintends and providentially cares for his children, it means then that in all things, regardless of what may come into our life, whether those things are good or bad, God works for the good of those who love him. Our challenge with that, by the way, is that we are oftentimes like the little boy trying to watch the prey through a knothole in the fence. All he can see is only what is right in front of him. God is not that way. He sees the past and the present and the future. He sees, as the prophet would say, the end from the beginning. And so God may well have a bigger picture than we are able to see. But we see the present. And because that oftentimes is our very limited perspective, we have almost come to expect that things ought to be well with us. I mean, if I'm serving God today, then God should take care of me today. And so when a loved one dies, when a business fails, when a heart breaks, we sometimes get angry with God. You've let me down. You owe me an explanation here. But what happens in that, ladies and gentlemen, is that listen to me, we are expecting God to keep the deal that we unilaterally made with him. Not that he made with us, but that we made with God. God, I'll be your child, but I expect you to take pretty good care of me. And yet God never, what was that old song? God never promised us a rose garden. And even if he gives you a rose garden, there are going to be some thorns from time to time. It's interesting that Job thought God owed him an explanation. Remember that? What an amazing story that is. And Job, Job tiptoes up to the very edge of blasphemy, does he not? I mean, his toes are hanging over the edge. Because he's saying, you know what, if I could just have 5 minutes with God, I tell you what, if I could have 5 minutes with God, we'd straighten this out. I would, you remember his word? I would demand of him. If I'd been standing by Job, I would have stepped to the side because I figured lightning was going to come right then. But God never gives Job an explanation. Job never does say, Job, I am so sorry. And I'm really sorry you don't understand this. Now, Job, sit down here and let's talk for a while. And let me see if I can explain this all to you. He just doesn't ever do that. And I don't know why exactly that is. I think it's probably because that even if God could have explained it to Job, it wouldn't have relieved any of his suffering. And so God is a holy God. There's some things we're not going to understand. Except maybe the truth that Jesus spoke when he said in John 16, look, in this world you shall have tribulation. Tribulation, a word that means to press or to crush. But be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And God is God is sovereign. And so Habakkuk retreats to that. And that's what he says. You, Lord, have appointed them. You've appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. And so God is a sovereign God. Part of the word sovereign, as you well know, is that word reign. This is what God does. He is a sovereign, reigning God. He ordains, he establishes, he controls nations. But don't misunderstand, ladies and gentlemen. A king may be absolute sovereign in his realm, and yet not necessarily cause or approve of everything that happens in his kingdom. Sometimes people erroneously believe that everything that happens is a part of God's foreordained plan. That's just not the case. The fact is, we live in a fallen world. And as Isaiah would say, time and chance, they happen to them all. But when we have this mindset that somehow God has ordained everything that bad that happens in our lives, we end up saying some bad things to people. I know that sometimes when people are hurting or suffering, we feel like we've got to say something. But sometimes we say things that just cannot be biblically sustained. God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to behold. Well, the Bible didn't say that. God wouldn't put this on you if he didn't know you could handle it. There's a lesson from God in here somewhere for you. Well, that's our rationale. That's not Bible rationale. This is perhaps a good place to just mention, that the Bible says that suffering, difficulties, troubles, tribulation in life come from a variety of different sources. You know this. Honesty compels me first to acknowledge that some suffering may well be from God. There were 10 plagues that rained down on Egypt, and people suffered and died, and they came from God. And so some suffering may come from God. And in fact, the Hebrew writer, talked about that. You remember that? Of course you do. You're a good Bible student. Hebrews 11 and verse 6, whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. He scourges every son whom he receives. And so some chastening, some discipline comes from the Lord. In fact, to Israel, in the book of Hosea, chapter 2, verse 11, God told the prophet Hosea, tell my people this, I will give you the valley of Achor as a door of hope. Achor means pain. God said to the people, I'm going to give you pain to try to save your soul. And then again, the Hebrew writer comes along and he says, look, whom the Lord loves, he chastens. I know Ralph Walker was with you week before last. I heard Ralph in a sermon once ask, has God ever given you a whipping? That's a good question, isn't it? Maybe some of the difficulties that come sometimes is God saying, you need to straighten up and do better. Some suffering is self-inflicted. And you know that. Don't be deceived. God's not mocked. Man sows what he reaps. And so some of the things that happen to us, it's just self-inflicted, isn't it? Some suffering is a result of other people's action. And that's hard. We grapple with that, don't we? Joseph was a good young man. Joseph was evidently a righteous and godly young man. And yet he suffered terribly, suffered at the hands of his brothers who put him in a pit. Pit is a Hebrew word that means that when you are there, you are fixing to die. They intended for him to die there till they sold him. And then he suffers at the hand of a ruler's wife who lies about him. And then he suffers at the hand of a fellow prisoner who forgets his kindness. And so he suffered repeatedly at the hands of others. I'll guarantee you in your church family, a church of this size, tragically, I'll guarantee you that there are either husbands or wives here who have suffered the infidelity of a mate and have suffered the heartbreak that doesn't end from that. So some suffering is the result of other people. We grapple with that. Some suffering is a result of Satan, and we ought to be honest about that. The book of Job, Job is asking God, what's going on here? I need to know. But we know. We were allowed in chapters 1 and 2 of the book to see behind the curtain and to see what was going on there. And so, so we know. It's important to remember the book of Job that the antagonist is not God. The antagonist in the book of Job is our adversary, the devil. And when he shows up, bad things happen. All the way from the beginning. If you need a good clue by that, he shows up as a snake. Nothing ever good comes from a snake. And unfortunately, Satan's influence is something we can't escape. You know, if you happen to have a really, really horrible neighbor, and you just decide, you know what, I can't live by this person anymore. They've made my life miserable. I can't take it anymore. I can't live by this neighbor anymore. You know what you can do? You can move. But you can't move out of this world. And John was really clear. The whole world lies under the sway of the evil one, he said. And so the fact of the matter is that bad things are going to happen to good people as long as Satan is active in this world. It's one of the great things that God shows us in the Revelation when he talks about Satan being bound, that whatever leash he's on and however long that is, eventually he's going to be reeled in and he will not have any sway anymore. But most suffering, of course, comes because we live in a fallen world. In Romans 8, we've mentioned Romans 8 2 or 3 times this afternoon. That in Romans, let me go back. I'm sorry, I thought I had that on the screen. I'm sorry. In Romans 8, in verse 22, Paul said, we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pain together until now. Romans 8 is all about suffering, from beginning to end. It deals with suffering. And in Romans 8 in verse 22, he says, look, the whole creation groans and labors. It's a fallen world. And somebody says, well, why didn't God, here we go back with our questions for God, why didn't God create a world where there was no suffering and no pain and there was no sin and none of these things that we have to deal with? And the answer is, he did. That's the world he did create. But again, our adversary, the devil, and selfish human will got in the way of that. When man first sinned, everything was thrown out of balance. When God says to Adam, from the sweat of your brow, the earth is going to bring forth thorns and thistles, it was his way of saying that creation, my perfect creation, is from this point on marred. Jesus taught, and he said, the rain falls on the just and on the unjust. Both the goodness and the blessings of God in this life fall on those who are good and just and those who are unjust. They get to revel in the good things that God provides in this world as well. But the rain of trouble also falls on the just and the unjust. Fires and tornadoes and cancer and broken relationships and broken hearts. And then, finally, along this line, Habakkuk says, what I know about you is, God, that you're faithful, that you will always keep your word. God made promises and he keeps his covenant. And so Habakkuk says, here's what I know. We will not die. I know you will not do that to us. I know that you made promises to us as a nation, and so I know that we will not die. I know that you are faithful. Ladies and gentlemen, the issue is not, where is God when I hurt? The issue is, God is where he has always been. He is faithful and loving. The issue is, where is my faith when I hurt? That's where it's always been the question. In Hebrews 3 and verse 1, the Hebrew writer said, Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus. Now, I want to say just a word about that. If you want to see the faithfulness of God, then just look at a verse like this and just think about the implications of the words that I have underlined. First is that we are holy brethren. God and Jesus look at us and they say, you are holy brethren. Our challenge is that sometimes we don't feel like holy brethren. Sometimes our mindset is, look, if we are holy brethren, then where is God? Then why do my kids get sick like everybody else? Why is there sometimes trouble in my marriage like other people's marriage? Why do I suffer like everyone else? Why doesn't God take better care? If I am holy brethren, then why didn't God do a better job taking care of me? And the answer is, consider Jesus Christ. He is the apostle. He is an apostle. That's a term we don't often think about with Jesus. But an apostle, you know, again, being good Bible students, it simply means it is someone who is sent by God. And so Jesus was sent by God to give us a living illustration, not only of God's unconditional love, but of fidelity in the midst of difficult circumstances. You and I have never suffered like Jesus. I pray we never will suffer like Jesus. But even as Jesus suffered the death on the cross, he was committed and faithful to his God. Into your hands I commend my spirit. So consider the one sent by God to teach us of God's unfailing love and the fact that you can be faithful, as the Revelation writer would say, unto death. And consider he is our high priest. He is our priest. Priest is an interesting word. The Latin derivation of priest, at its root, means to be a bridge. It is a bridge. And so in many ways, Jesus is a bridge builder. You remember Simon and Garfunkel saying, "A bridge over troubled water." I read the other day, that song has been covered by more than 300 artists. A bridge over, now you young people have to ask your mom and dad who Simon and Garfunkel were. And Garfunkel was a real person, that just had an odd name. But why did that song so resonate with people? Because we're all looking for that. We're looking for some kind of a bridge to get us over troubled waters. And that's what Jesus is. It's why the Hebrew writer said in chapter 4, look, we need to come boldly to the throne of grace to find mercy and grace to help in times of need. We can do that because of Jesus Christ. All right, one final thing before the trap door opens and I disappear out of your sight. I've got just 3 or 4 minutes left. I want to talk about what shall we do? The cry of why. How do we answer that? What should we do? I want to just give you some bullet points. I'm not going to talk about any of these. Let me just give these to you quickly before we stop. What should we do as we ask that cry of why? Number 1, don't judge God. Don't judge God. Job understood that fundamentally. In Job 9, and beginning of verse 32, Job confessed, "He is not a man as I am that I should answer him." Job really knew better than some of the things he was saying. And so he says, I cannot judge God. Again, remember, God is not the antagonist. He's not the enemy. Our adversary, the devil, is that. Secondly, look to the cross. Look to the cross. Romans 5 and verse 8, God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Dr. Paul Brand, in one of his writings, asked, where is God when I hurt? And he answered, he is in you, the one hurting, not in it, the thing that hurts. The cross, ladies and gentlemen, look to the cross. The cross forever reveals the kind of world we live in, one of gross unfairness. And the cross also forever reveals what kind of a God we have, a God of sacrificial love. Third, keep your perspective. Again, Romans 8, what did Paul say? I consider that the difficulties of this life are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed with us. Somebody says about their suffering, you know what, Don, I tell you, Don, I don't think I can live with this for the next 20 or 30 years. You don't have to. You have to live with it today. We just have to live with it today. And in this day, with our faith intact, asking God to help us face another day. And fourth, be of help to others. When you're going through your difficulty and you're navigating that, as difficult as it may be of help to others. That's what Paul said, by the way. 2 Corinthians 1, beginning in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercy and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our tribulation. Listen to this. God comforts us in all of our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the same comfort with which we have been comforted by God. I mean, you'd have to work to miss the implication of that. Old-time gospel preachers used to say, God pours into us so that we can pour out into the lives of others. And that's what Paul is saying. Fifth, ask God for help. Do you remember how the book of James begins? Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into trials of various kinds. And you'll spend about 12 verses talking about the kind of difficulties that can arise in our lives, challenges, suffering, troubles that we can have. But in the middle of that, he says, let me go back. In the middle of that, in verse 5, he says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and will not chide you or upbraid you for asking. In the context, what you're asking about is, God, help me with this. Help me in this difficult. Help me in this trial, this circumstance, the difficulty. Help me. And he says God will do that. And then sixth, not only pray God for help, but pray for deliverance, especially for deliverance from temptation to sin. Because in our trials, James would talk about in James chapter 1, when he segues out of the physical trials that we face, he segues out of that immediately into the spiritual aspect of that, and he says, make sure that those physical trials don't cost you your soul. It's why Peter said, look, you got to pray every day. You got to be sober and vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a prowling lion, seeking whom he may devour. And he goes on, we always stop, we put a period there and stop. But in the next verse he says, you resist him and be steadfast in your faith, and understand that the same sufferings, whatever you're going through, the same sufferings, whatever they may be, are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. We're not a special case. May the God of all grace, who called us to eternal glory by Christ, after you suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle. And that's why the final thing is, we need to accept that challenge. That's what James said, James 1, the beginning of verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures under trial, because once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And so we've got to accept that challenge. We've got people in our church family right now at Temple Terrace who are facing amazing challenges. They have diagnoses that would just bring anyone to their knees. And yet they are facing it with such resiliency and courage and faith. And in many ways, they have taught us through much of their life how to live. And it may well be that over the next several months, they will also teach us how to die. Because they've accepted that challenge. Where's God when we hurt? He is where he has always been, right by our side, fulfilling the promise of Hebrews 13 and beginning in verse 5. I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. You need him by your side tonight. You know, we're all God's creation, but we're not all God's children. We're God's children by adoption into his family through the water of baptism. And so if that's your need tonight, if you need to become God's child and you need to come home to your Father, this invitation's for you. Let's stand and let's sing.